So, welcome everybody. Let's face it, most business people do not like geopolitics. We normally enjoy much more a world without politics influence, optimizing things and pursuing things for doing business. But as we have seen now, this is getting more and more important. And therefore, strategists and business leaders must think what are the consequences of these geopolitical movements for their businesses. Yeah? And that's the task that we want to tackle a little bit for this plenary. So most important are the guests. And here I have the pleasure to present three extraordinary personalities. One is Claudia Süssmuth. Dyckerhoff, she also did her PhD here at St.Gallen, went 21 years to McKinsey in Asia, mostly China, but also in other countries, and is currently sitting on the board of a couple firms such as Clariant and others. The second gentleman is from Bavaria. His name is Christian Kohlpainter. He also worked for Clariant several years ago, but he's now the CEO and chairman of the corporation called Brenntag. And Brenntag is the largest global chemical distribution company, basically on the planet. And I looked here again because it's an impact with 600 sites in 72 nations. So clearly geopolitics matters for that firm quite heavily. He holds a PhD in chemistry from the Technical University in Munich. And the last one is Dr. Patrick Müller. He's the chairman of the Partners Board of Vaillant. Vaillant is a market leader in heating, cooling, and hot water solutions with about 17,000 people. He's also a graduate of St.Gallen. So we have three people here from St.Gallen and one person from the TUM, the Technical University. But all three have a very strong experience working in global environments. Okay. So before I start, I was asked to show a little bit two slides. As you have seen, we are doing this survey, or students have been doing that. Can you bring that in? Okay. And then I will already ask my first question. That's the leaders of tomorrow in terms of what do they expect in scale of change and the nature of scale. And as we already have heard today in the beginning, we see here again the leaders of tomorrow think there's much more scale for change, while the more senior people are thinking, well, it's happening, but not on the same degree. Okay, though, again, you might say there's a certain discrepancy between the younger and this more senior one. And the second one would be long-term stability and prosperity. It's clear most of the younger one grew up in a quite stable world, but they are now more concerned that things are going to change tremendously, while in the senior executive area, you see more a type of split. And probably many of these people have already gone through a lot of upheaval, so they are more used to that. Yeah? But you see, the younger generation is more concerned about these issues. What are factors behind that? I don't want to analyze too much, as we have seen also if you look globally, not only on optimism, but also on suicide rates, all these. It's increasing tremendously among the young, less about the senior ones. And as you're aware in studies on happiness, the older you get, people seem to become more happy with their life and more also, in a way, accepting what has been happening. Do you have any comments on this development? You have kids, you have 5, you have 2, you have 1, very fresh one, probably not yet able to stay. But how would you say, is this difference coming?
Well, I think I have a relatively simple explanation. I think it is experience and what we have been exposed to in a short life or in a long life. And I think we sometimes tend to forget what kind of crisis we went through already over the last 30, 40 years. And for a younger generation, sometimes what you feel, and I discuss it with my kids who are 30 and 21, for them, to some extent, everything is quite new and threatening. Whereas we grew up in a Cold War scenario, where, when I was in the military service, we were threatened by Russians being not too far away from the border of Germany and having NATO alarms because there could be an attack. So I think it is a little bit based on the experience and the background and what you have seen already in your life. And so for me, it's a very natural outcome in my point of view, but that might be a little bit more, the more relaxed view on that outcome. But I don't know what the other colleagues have in mind here.
I guess I would say there are clearly also areas where I'm very concerned, but I agree with you that when you work in different businesses, you have seen how different teams, businesses deal with crisis, and then you see already that sometimes it's not just an interesting opportunity, but also that there is more strength afterwards. And I think for the younger generation, they don't have those reference points. So if, I take our oldest son is 25 and we have 5 kids, obviously the others are younger, but they will compare it to what happened a few years ago, and that was all looking much better compared to where we are now. So I think I get that picture, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we celebrated our 150 years anniversary last year. And then we looked back in the history and we thought, how many challenges did we had in these 150 years? Now we say we are in front of a transformation. We go from gas to heat pumps. But, there were 2 world wars. There was a world economic crisis. There was something called the Ruhrputsch, which was for the area where the company is based, very, very severe. And every generation, now the 5th generation, find a solution to overcome these challenges. So I think there is a tendency that you see your own challenge as the biggest, but if you put it in perspective for the last 150 years, I think everything is kind of manageable and you have to put everything in perspective.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then let's move a little bit now to the overarching topic. As we said, it's about geopolitics and the impact of that on value chains and corporate strategy. Let me set the context. I would like to emphasize very shortly 6 points. The first is we already see a reduction of globalization since 2021. So since 2021, the international trade flows have overall decreased, but with differences in certain regions. The second thing is we see is this breakup into these geopolitical spheres. Yeah, it's not just the US, but it's also across the things. You see also then associations like Mercosur, also like we have seen in Africa. So geographical spheres that are basically emerging. And then we know that you have increased trade within them, but not necessarily across them. What we see currently is just one snapshot, but it's not basically the end of evolution. Basically, it has already started a couple of years ago. Then clearly what we see is this increase of this direct power-based deal-making and the degrees of this unilateral WTO ruling. So currently if you have a problem, many firms and also states don't go to the WTO any longer, but they directly try to find under negotiation terms with others a solution for what they want to do. Then we see also in these spheres a very strong push for technological sovereignty. This is going on. Europe wants to basically try to go into a certain way of autonomy. The US already tries to have it, but we see the same clearly in China and also in areas in the Middle East and somewhere. So everybody's pushing for technological superiority, but also decoupling from the others. And I think that's an interesting trend. And then also interesting, I think that fits to the conference, we see a shift of economic activity across the global south. Mm-hmm. And this is not necessarily only here, which is unfortunately still the case in terms of Africa as a way of exploiting resources, but you see that also when you look at investment in Asia countries and also in South American countries. So basically the West, Northern Hemisphere, is pushing also much more into 2001. So these are 6, I think, developments that are shifting. Now, the question for strategy people or business leaders is now, what does that mean for my own organization? And again, I have now a couple of things, but I want to put them as questions. The first I would raise, as we see, or as, for example, the CEO of VW told us, they are thinking about setting up the corporation in terms of 3 business models, one for the US, one for Europe, and one for Asia. So my question would be, do you also see in your firms this modularization of corporates into different business models, or even in the extreme, as we see here with Holcim. Holcim is splitting itself in 2 parts, one for Europe and the rest of the world, and one under the heading of Americe in the United States. Is that something you are concerned about or you're dealing with?
I can start reflecting on it from a Clariant perspective, and that is specialty chemicals. Clariant is already there, and that might be really based on, with chemicals, specialty chemicals, closeness to customers is key. And therefore, the business model of Clariant is not only a deeply rooted specialty chemicals where you get the raw materials, but being really regionalized. So we have innovation hubs, production sites, regionalized. And hence, up to 90% of the raw materials are sourced regionally. Production is happening regionally. And I think that business model has nothing to do with Trump. It is the model that we have followed for many years. And it obviously helps for having the safety on raw materials, but also working very closely with suppliers. That's very key. And I think the whole dynamic has accelerated selecting the right suppliers, understanding where you might have some weaknesses in raw material sourcing, but also working with those suppliers on innovation towards the customer. And therefore, regionalization is already what Clariant is fully living up to. Hence, there is not a real shock based on what is asked by a Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it depends a little bit how you want to tackle the problem, and there are, I think, multiple ways of how to do this. I agree with Claudia that the chemical industry, I think, has done a tremendous job in the past of already internationalizing its business and also its asset footprint substantially. So when I talk to the leaders of the chemical industry, they are actually around the primary effects of those tariffs rather relaxed, because they say we to a large proportion source and produce in that region. For us as distributors, and Brenntag is the largest chemical distributor worldwide, with 40% of its business in Europe, 40% in North America, 10% in Asia, and 10% in Latin America. It's even more extreme. So more than 90% what we are distributing in a certain region is actually sourced regionally. So the primary effects, in my point of view, out of this tariff debate is probably rather limited for the chemical industry. But what hits us brutally are the secondary and tertiary effects, which we can expect. I'm sure we talk about this later, so I will not go in depth here. But what I would do to tackle that increasing geopolitical tension and the constellations which could emerge is continue that path of diversifying your asset footprint in making sure that you move your supply chains, what I think called several years ago during COVID, from just in time to just in case. Mm-hmm. And what I criticize in our industry, that after COVID happened and things became a little bit relaxed, some people lost that priority to think about the just-in-case supply chain setup, which is necessary to have an inherent hedge against these geopolitical shocks. Mm-hmm. And this is now fully on the agenda like it was 2020. I have already a déjà vu. The same stuff we discussed in 2020, we discussed today. And so I'm wondering sometimes, have we not learned enough out of that COVID period? Mm-hmm.
I think as a company, you have to manage your risk appetite and manage your risk level. And we are at the moment in a transformation. We go from gas into heat pumps. And that's already quite a big challenge for any kind of company if you change the technology. Then we have been in China for a long time, since 1981 in Hong Kong. So it's really a market where we are even market leader there with 19% market share. So it was a really important area for us, where we also see, we believe in China long term. And now the question comes, should we also go into the US? Because now with Biden, with the Inflation Reduction Act, suddenly the US became very attractive for green technologies. Before that was not the case. And we really thought about it, is this a clever strategy, or is the risk too big to do both? To do China and the US, and then potentially at one point, the US says either you're with us or you're against us, so then you really have a problem. So we deliberately said we want to be in Europe and we want to be in China, but for the moment, we don't want to be in the US.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This raises another issue that we might discuss along two lines. The first would be businesses. In terms of, over the last years, we everywhere had this strong impetus for concentration on your core. Yeah, so the amount of firms being diversified was strongly reduced for several reasons. So the first question would be, will we probably now see also an increase in diversification across different businesses? And the second then, but I will touch that in another one, is this in terms of diversification of countries or your geographical spread. But let's start first with the first one. Everybody said always focus on your core over the last years, and all conglomerates were punished. But do we see now perhaps more a move again for more businesses you are in, as opposed to you are in less in?
Again, I start from chemicals. I think it's more diversification within the businesses you are, and that is very much customer driven. So I think what I see as a very important aspect of the Clariant business is sustainability is core of our strategy. And so we have that in different business areas, you know, from care chemicals, and which is more consumer oriented. And the point is within those businesses to work with customers on very customized solutions. And in that sense, of course, you have a certain diversification within that business, but it's still very much in your broader context. And for me, the successful companies will be those that are really so close to the customer, very fast in responding, working with them on solutions, understanding, you know, where they need to react, pretty much also where they need to react to regulatory constraints, you know, like what Europe is putting up with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, things like that need to be factored in. And I think that is a certain diversification within the scope. But not necessarily going broad.
I think it depends a little bit on how you define core and what is actually the core of your business. And the simplest definition I'm always using is what do you do really, really well? And it can be anything. It can be from producing specialty chemicals, it can be from distributing chemicals, it can be marketing, it can be technology which is used and needed by many people. But you need to be crystal clear that whatever you do, you need to make sure that this core is diversified to, as I said, almost built into your strategy for this kind of geopolitical tensions which could come up. This is what I would always look when I would assess a business strategy. Is this incorporating this element? I don't believe that adding now business to business and managing equally successful is a recipe for success. I believe it's a recipe for failure. What I believe is a necessary recipe we need to deal with as the European chemical industry in particular is actually thinking about consolidation of various players. And I'm sure we talk about this later. What is the future of the European chemical industry? This is an overdue movement where we need to clearly restructure the European asset base and where we also need to clearly come to consolidation of relevant players to withstand this enormous competitive pressure which will come out of Asia, out of the Middle East, and in particular also out of North America, based on very cheap gas and very cheap energy.
I like this Warren Buffett quote, if you don't know what to do, you diversify. And I kind of think what you said, I think you have to do what you're really good at, and you can't be good at everything. And the competitive pressure gets bigger. And I can give you one example. So during COVID, of course, Bergamo was really closed down, and we have a very innovative kind of supplier that does heat exchangers. And this is the #1 worldwide leader in heat exchanger. They do nothing else than very innovative and cost competitive little heat exchangers. Now, after Bergamo, we said maybe we have a second supplier, and maybe we'd even try it ourselves to do it because we need a lot of those. But to be fair, they were just better. And when we reached that step that they were last year, they were already 5% better. And I think this focus on what you're really good at reduces cost, creates innovation, and I think it's very seldom that you can do everything yourself at the level that you need to get through the competitive pressure. I think you have to focus where you're really good at and not over-diversify.
Now, let's take the second dimension, this geographical diversification. Here was a gentleman today from Botswana, from Singapore. Your two firms, if I recall correctly, are strongly here, for example, yours in Europe and in North America. What's with Africa? What's with South America? What's with Asia? Clariant is already, as far as I know, pretty spread, but for example, your firm. Both, yeah. Let's start with Christian.
Okay. No, I think we are pretty much spread. We are in 72 countries, and many of those countries are residing in Africa. It's just that the business size is not comparable to what we currently do in Europe and in North America, which is 40-40, by the way, already quite for a German chemical distribution company, relatively strong. The opportunities in Africa are there, and we also look into how we can improve our business, but it's also not an easy area to really grow a chemicals business. That's also I must say pretty clear. So you need to focus on your core markets, which is Asia, China, Europe, and North America as a chemical company, and this is what you need to do. But it's the irony, for instance, of our industry, that we are actually the only truly global chemical distributor. Even our next competitor, which is an American-based one, is 80% North America and 20% Europe. But I'm coming always from that idea: what do I need to do to have an embedded de-risking element in my strategy? And this means clearly diversifying your supply chains as much as we can, because you need to be able to maintain supply to your customers. And even in the worst days of COVID, we as Brenntag could always maintain a certain supply to any customer, being it in Europe or in North America or in Asia, and keep them running. A customer can live with a 30% supply. He can't live with zero, because then he needs to shut down his unit. But if you are able to supply to him 20-30% of what this customer needs, then you keep him running and keep him happy. So you need to build an inherent business model which allows you to maintain supply to your customers at any time. And this is what you said, Claudia, being really close to your customers and understanding what the customers need. In our cases, keep them running. Keep them running no matter what. And this is what I think is an inherent de-risking model we have in place due to our setup, and we continue to foster that, including also what we do in Africa.
There's also this, if you recall, the slogan of local for local, moving in that direction. But also clearly there's this trade-off between resilience and flexibility, and on the other side, between optimal efficiency. Because clearly if you have second supplier, third supplier, if you have perhaps an additional warehouse, all these things are adding additional costs. Yeah. So how do you handle this trade-off between, on the one side, this resilience build up across the value chain, and on the other side, the efficiency issue that you had before when that was no problem?
No, but I think you gave the answer already. I think it really requires very systematic supplier segmentation. And before that step is really understanding which raw materials do you need and what do your customers need. And to develop those solutions, then you come to the supplier aspect. And again, we don't have 4, 5, 6 suppliers for the same things, but at least 2, 3, and to really understand, how do you work with them? Who is the supplier that really develops innovation with you? Who is a pure raw material supplier? And who is maybe also a supplier that has way more strategic implications and could play a bigger role in a region? And if you do that well, then you can also in their interest manage the cost side, because that also helps them. And I think in chemicals, the margins are not like in pharma. You have to manage your margin again and again and again, and you have to constantly look into your portfolio and think about, how long is this really specialty chemicals and not becoming commodity, right? And that creates another healthy dynamic to keep up profitability.
Mm-hmm. How do you handle the trade-off?
I think if you have these two sides of supply chain, one is flexibility, the other one is resilience. And I think the last 70 years were quite unique in regards to stability, in regards to prosperity, in regards to peace. And I think supply chain could move from resilience to efficiency. And the just-in-time is probably the best level of efficiency. And that led to a lot of good things. That led to prosperity. That led to people accessing health, accessing education, accessing mobility. that in the end leads to more prosperity. There's like this virtuous circle. If you go back to resilience and less efficiency, that costs more. In the end, the consumer pays more. And I can give you a little example. I was running a dairy business, Müller Milch in the UK during Brexit. And normally in spring you have more milk, and what normally happens, you sell the milk to Ireland, they have dryers and they sell it as baby powder to China. And that's quite profitable. Now Brexit meant no trade there anymore, no logistics, so we had to build our own dryers. One dryer, only our company had 3 dryers, so one dryer is 100 million, and who pays that? The consumer. But even worse, because it was not an EU product, we didn't get the same prices in China as the EU. So the prices were significantly lower. So now the milk price for the consumer is 1.55 per 4 pints, that's the 2.2 liters, and it used to be £1 for 4 pints. So 55% more, because some, take care of our border things ideology. In the end, the consumer pays it. If supply chains move from efficient to more resilient, and if you do everything yourself.
Mm-hmm. And I think that triggers another thought, right? We can talk about individual companies, but then if you think really about regions, and let's now focus on Europe. There are certain chemicals, we talked about it this morning, that are no longer produced in Europe. And that was all fine because we could get them from elsewhere. Now, if we want to strengthen the individual regions, and Europe has clearly a disadvantage in terms of energy prices, and certain chemicals that we either do on purpose no longer produce, or we don't have the raw materials, then of course from a region perspective, there are some constraints. And then a region Europe would need to figure out, how do we either deal with energy prices, big thing, secondly, with some raw materials that we don't have, and from where do we get them? And if we don't get them anymore from the US, do we then get them from the Middle East? We are looking, obviously, everybody's looking to Middle East now. And I think it really requires a European solution there, because otherwise, different companies in Europe will not be competitive. And this goes well beyond just the company perspective, and I think that's an important one to address.
In my limited business experience, we were always thinking, because it was in publicly listed firms, about where's growth coming from the next years. And I was trained, there are 2 ways, organic growth and M&A. Interestingly now, you see globally, already in 3-4 years, more strategic alliances, digital platforms, ecosystems, and M&A deals. For example, even currently, M&A is quite low. So does this have an impact for your business? Do you think you will go more in this alliance? As you mentioned before, you need consolidation, which I think is probably an M&A game. But are there other ways, perhaps, because M&A could also go terribly wrong? From academia, we know 75% do not reach preset objectives. I know Clariant had a very good track record, but at the beginning they had this huge, terrible acquisition in the UK. It took them very long to get that under control again.
Yeah, we were cleaning up that mess at that time, that's true. No, but seriously, I want to distinguish between the chemical distribution market we are in, which is an extremely fragmented market. So we are world market leader, we have about 16 billion turnover. We have still around 6% market share, 6%. The number 2 has a market share of 3.8%. And then if you go to the number 3 and 4, it's 1% market share. So in a humongous fragmented industry, where of course M&A, and we spend every year €500 million on M&A, €500 million, repeatedly every year on buying smaller companies, integrating them. So M&A for us is really a growth contributor significantly to grow the platform. It's different in the chemical manufacturing industry. There, the degree of consolidation is much, much higher. But nevertheless, when you really look on the European chemical industry itself in the landscape, we have about 12, 14 players who are all lost in the deadlock of their strategies. And I think what I said before is, I have the luxury now, being 33 years in the industry, knowing it very well, and as a distributor the last 5 years really standing a little bit on the sidelines and watching what's going on. The consolidation of the European chemical industry is overdue. And there needs to be a clear path going forward through smart moves to create really stronger players. The European chemical industry has totally lost its competitiveness over the last 15 years. If you just take some numbers, in 2008, which is 15 years ago, 22% of the world chemical demand was served out of Europe, 22%. In 15 years, this dropped to 13%. And if you describe competitiveness as being able to maintain at least your market share, it tells you that we should not talk about restoring or maintaining Europeans' competitiveness. It's already gone. And we need to create players who are able to withstand that pressure. I have no solution of how this gets done, but it's overdue, and there need to be some clear decisions, also from a political standpoint of view, necessary to support that. And I just take one example. This is antitrust. We need to make sure that the competition laws in Europe are considering that the consolidation in such a critical industry like the chemical industry doesn't need this almost perverted competition law we have now in Europe. And I think some people understand this. It's in the airline industry, it is in the telecom industry. They understand this, the politicians. When I talk to the politicians about it, they said, whoop, we never had the chemical industry on our radar in that sense. But at least somebody needs to start to talk about this, because I think there needs to be some boundary changes necessary, which allows for that consolidation, which, again, as I said, in my point of view, is overdue since 10 years.
Claudia, as you also have broad experience with firms in different industries and also sitting on the board there, like Prudential or Ramsay Healthcare, they're also mainly M&A game, or is it more alliance game in these areas?
Okay, these are obviously quite some different sectors, right? I mean, if you take pharma, the big pharma players, they all have a big portion, which is ultimately acquisitions of smaller biotechs, right? They might start as a collaboration and then it is more. And in pharma, this will always be the model, because none of the big pharma players has the pure inorganic pipeline development. It's not there. And is also not needed because there are other players who are agile and innovative. So that's a good model to source from different sources, if you wish. I think in insurance, totally different game, because there it depends so much on where are you on your skills and your customers, depending on the regulations, what can you do in your own market, and if you expand, what do you need to kind of acquire, right? So there is not one solution here. I think it's very different aspects. Having said that, I think, again, coming back to what's going on geopolitically, I think there is now more of an, at least, openness to think way more in, you mentioned it today, ecosystems. Because not everybody wants to immediately go into a bigger corporate, but to work together and understand in which areas, and AI is a good area, where can we work on some solutions and bring that forward without necessarily always building bigger new conglomerates. I think there is a way higher likelihood of more ecosystems.
Also, this issue of ecosystems, it's again what we have seen also in research, quite different from sector to sector. For example, in the insurance industry in Switzerland, it was a disaster for all firms, while in other countries these things are working quite well. But again, you have to look very careful on the sector by sector or the industry type, but there the differences are quite huge, what you can see about that. Now, you mentioned, Christian, already a topic, I think, which is getting very important, regulation. Here's also the vice president of Singapore, and he told us that when he is in contact with business, they talk each month, and then he tries to make it smooth, that they can operate better. Will you beef up your muscles in your regulation affairs by own offices, own people who are basically dealing on a European or German or global level?
I think it is extremely important that you keep an intense dialogue and do it in the right tonality. I think sometimes as our industry we have been a little bit too noisy in my point of view. I think we need to be, have in-depth discussions with the relevant decision takers in a way that they understand the complexity of how the value chains are actually connected and how, I would say, vulnerable they are if you don't make sure that they can really prosper and continue to develop. What I learn in those discussions, that there is an increasing understanding of that we have turned the knob or the pendulum too far in the direction of regulation and deregulation is now on the agenda. I think this is clear. Nevertheless, insanity happens every day. Like last week where we had this debate that every car which is older than 10 years need to go to an inspection now every year. Who in the world comes to such an idea when we talk about we need to do less regulation than more? Just a simple example. Yeah. And I think this is where I'm very happy now that we have, hopefully after yesterday's first disaster, now a stable German government who is able to push back, because there was a strong voice from Germany saying, you can do this, but this insanity we will not do. And I think we need to push back, because those people create more and more and more regulation. And what I see for our industry, when you look on what is the first ideas of how we can renew, reach, and what monster will be created again here, I say, guys, I mean, you need to wake up. This is the last what the European chemical industry needs now, that we are putting a new novel for reach on top with the justification. And I heard it verbally in Brussels. Well, this regulation is 20 years old. It's about time that we do something new. Yeah, right? You just cannot wait and let us work and operate in the framework, which is already the best in the world, by the way. And let us do our job, and let's not further punish the European chemical industry where we're already struggling for survival.
Yeah. No, I also think Europe really has to wake up, but we don't know if it's happening. Yeah. The hope is there, but they have to deliver. And if you currently look what's happening in France and Italy, Germany, so far nothing is happening. Perhaps things are moving on. And one thing is clearly the whole thing on deregulation. And I think it's always problematic if we already have a bureaucracy setting up on deregulation. First thing would probably be delete this whole bureaucracy on deregulation affairs. But that as a side remark. What are you doing more in your also Asian context?
Well, we never spent as much time with regulation than now. It's unbelievable, especially because some of the regulation is ideologic. So especially in Germany, Green Party put some regulation in that they want to actually tell you which kind of heating system you need in your specific house. And first of all, the customers don't buy that, they don't like that if somebody tells them exactly what to do. But it's an ideological problem. What you should do in regulation is get a framework, and then the market economies will deal with the thing. Get the framework right. If you want to push heat pumps, put the electricity price down, but don't try to have every detail kind of regulated, and then you have these DIN norms where if you want to change the heating system, you also have to change the window and the attic, and in the end it's so expensive that nobody does it. So I think to convince politicians to actually regulate on a higher level, to get the framework there and leave the market to do what the market can best, allocate capital, allocate technologies, that's what the market should do. But it's sometimes very frustrating if you deal with lobbyists, with politicians, with Brussels, but also Germany. It takes a lot of time, and it's not very beneficial for the end consumer or for the environment. Mm-hmm.
And we also have to say, also in the US, if you ever have done business in the US, you will see it's quite frustrating. So many regulations you have to take care of and you have to obey. So I'm not really sure it's so much better than in Europe, but I think that's also why Trump and others have tried now or in the process of deregulating things. But I think it's still everywhere a big problem. Probably mature societies quite often try to get better in formal processes, and this is then clearly, as we know also from research, decreasing growth, because the red tape is basically getting bigger and bigger. Good. Next issue. Are you starting to do more work with state-owned firms? Because that's another trend that a lot of firms, especially also in Asia, are state-owned, either fully or partially. They come up as competitors. Sometimes they're subsidized by the government. Is that an issue for you with the geopolitics? Because sometimes they have simply better terms than perhaps you might have.
to start with China?
So one of our biggest new competitors is Medea. 15 years ago, they were not there. Now they're 60 billion. The founder is a close friend to President Xi. I mean, a fantastic company, I have to admit, but very, very aggressive. And of course, they get some information that we don't get, or we get it later. And when there's a government subsidy program, they already know it a year before and can prepare, and we know it a day before. So these are the little things that's the difference. So that's why we also have to focus very much on what we're good at. We cannot do too much things because the competitive element on our heating business is much, much higher than, I would say, 15 years ago.
Again, different sectors, different topics, but the key point for me in general, like in China, you know, in general, I would say local competition is totally underestimated. And of course, there have also been government programs that have helped the local players to become really good at what they're doing. And so, dependent on sector, to really get market access, you need a local player. And that doesn't necessarily need to be a state-owned enterprise. It could also be a local private player, but you just need to understand for which part of your value chain do you need access, and where is that access maybe reduced because you are a multinational and have no chance, right? And that could be in insurance, that could be in healthcare. In chemicals, I would say the key takeaway is you really need to understand their skills because they're incredibly fast. And then there might sometimes be collaborations to work on innovative ideas. And it's really key to understand on what topics they are working and where they, you know, might get better conditions in terms of energy or the site or the plot of land. But it's really more about they have developed skills and to be part of that and to learn with them and to see where you can develop still mutual solutions to be in the game. Yeah. And therefore you need to have local people on the ground, otherwise zero chance.
I remember quite well the case of Clariant, Tianjin, number 5, where you had the alliance, and then I think 2 kilometers away, suddenly a military-owned, state-run firm was developing with the same technology and so on. So this is clearly then an issue with geopolitics about, as I mentioned before, technological sovereignty. Yeah, so everybody tries to get this in his grip.
But let me add one topic for the chemical industry, because I believe this is a real trend we have to watch in the industry. And what you have seen with ADNOC taking over Covestro is just the beginning. And when I said before, the restructuring and the consolidation of the European chemical industry, which is overdue, can either happen by the players themselves or somebody is doing it for them. And this is what ADNOC clearly does. They are building the next BASF. Yep. Very clearly, very structured, in a very deliberate, very well thought through, and very consequent move. And for me, it's very normal that this is going to happen. They can buy European assets at phenomenal low valuations, with all the know-how, with all the knowledge and everything. So that, for me, is just the beginning of that. And we need to carefully watch it. I mean, Sabic investment in Clariant is another example. It's already 10 years ago, but it's a similar case. So I think we need to be very cognizant of that. And I think today, from the top 10 chemical players compared to 20 years ago, as it is today, I think the half of it is already state-owned. So that's a trend which is clearly there, and it will gain speed. And with all the weak assets we have currently in Europe, and they're up for disposal or up for sale, I think the relevant players will make their calculations and then jump on the right opportunity. So I believe it's a very real movement and trend in the chemical industry.
Okay, so I would love to open now for the plenum. Thank you very much so far. You're not allowed to go because we continue discussing. So questions from your side. Either remarks on your position or also question you would raise to the panel. Please.
Thank you so much for the opportunity and very inspiring discussion. And my question is regarding the tariffs. Since right now the United States is tariffing China and also other countries. But I also think, what's your opinion, first of all, on the tariffs specifically? because at the end of the day, the United States will have a deal with China, a very good deal for both sides, that both sides will get somehow profit from it, but European Union and Germany and we as a Europe will not get a deal, so at the end of the day. So my question is to you, do you think tariffs are in the nowadays also a solution to get a good deal by the end of the day, because there will be a tariff war, but at the end of the day there will be a deal and find a solution to also save our industries, because most of our industries are under fire, and especially from lots of the car industry in Germany, for example. I'm from Germany and also a German politician, so I know it's a really, really difficult. I had lots of discussion with the car industries, automobile industries, and they're under fire, and the cars are coming very cheap, and there will be, in China it's easier to produce, and there's also lots of financial support from the government in subsidies, as you mentioned, Mr. Müller. So do you think it's also a possibility to think about it in a long term to support the industry in Europe, especially in Germany? Since I don't know if you're also from Germany, so I just think about this. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
No, thank you very much for this question. Personally, I think tariffs make the cake smaller for everyone. I think it's the wrong measure. I'm quite positive that if we negotiate with Donald Trump in a good way to make him look good, we, let's say Europe and the rest of the world, will get a deal. I'm not that positive with China. And on both sides, I think after when she became president, before it was Deng that had a paradigm about prosperity first. Then she came and the paradigm was, let's say, China first, and there was not an equal playing field for American companies in China. And I think at one point in 2019, 2020, it became the party first. And I think there are some quite significant differences between China and America. And personally, I wouldn't bet that in my lifetime this will be resolved. That is a bit negative. However, on the positive side, I think America will get deals with the rest of the world.
Just to add, I mean, obviously not easy to predict, right? But if I just take China and the US, obviously the US hurts itself dramatically as well, right? Because yes, they're better off at this point in commodity, let's take commodity chemicals for a moment, yes, and they have better, on the whole energy side, they are better equipped. But then there are other raw materials that they need from China. And obviously if they have these tariffs, then prices go up. That could really lead to a collapse in demand, right? And so it's not very clear how we would deal with that. And behind the scenes, we know already that for sure there are some discussions about exemptions on some very specific chemicals, because both sides know that it hurts them. So one hypothesis could be, yes, they might have an arrangement on some chemicals, but I don't think, it's because it's quite face-losing also for Xi. He will not easily give in, he will not be bullied by Trump. So I think that could be going on for a while. And then you're right, obviously, the European Union now tries, is there a deal with the Trump and to go to zero tax and all of that. There could be some dynamics there that could help Europe, right? We come back to Europe again, saying Europe really would need to frame what on earth do we want to be, right? What is Europe? What is our market description for different sectors? Where do we want to be key? I mean, China is so intelligent in that dimension. They have their 5-year plans. The China 2025, they're totally independent of Trump. They define their, independence and their resilience and all of that, and they went for it. And they're quite advanced in many sectors. And in Europe, we are very reactive, and we haven't really framed, these are the core sectors where we want to be strong, hence we also take the money in our hands and invest. That whole part is missing. If we were ready on that, we would be in a better position maybe to go for a deal. Yeah. So that doesn't really give you an answer, but I'm just thinking, I see definitely different dimensions and dynamics between a China and the US versus what's happening with Europe. Yeah.
And also 2 short comments. It's a very old thing. there's this Ricardo theory saying even if two countries produce two goods well, it's much better if the one is only producing one and the other one the other one. So tariffs bite everyone, yeah? And I think the Americans will feel that rather earlier than later. First inflation, but also they don't get it a lot out of that. And your second point, because you mentioned the car industry, we were working with VW. You really have to say, in terms of technological excellence, they brought in 10 cars from China. They're excellent, great cars. So they have to beef up, and they're in the process of doing that. If they will succeed, I do not know. But you really have to say they did that quite well. And China, to be clear, they prepared themselves for 5 years now for Trump. Their share to the United States is about 12%. They can survive that, yeah? So I also agree with him. It's not clear that China will anyhow kick in. I think America will see that it really shot itself in the food, but it still takes time until everybody sees that. But it will come, I'm quite sure.
I think it's quite interesting to look at the rare earth numbers.
Yeah.
So 66% of the rare earth is mined in China, but 85% of the processing is in China. And they spend about 60 billion, or gave loans for 60 billions to African countries to process as well. So there they have the grab as well. So America will have quite a lot of trouble to get to these materials. So I think I agree, he shot himself in the foot, but we never know what is going to happen. He is very erratic.
Please.
Yeah, thank you very much to all the speakers for sharing and for being so honest. So I'd be interested in hearing a bit more on the challenges that you feel you don't have a response to in principle. So with regards to all these geopolitical challenges, the challenges you feel you don't have an idea of how to solve them. A lot of the tariffs, for instance, we know in principle how to deal with that. It's a question of implementation and political will, but I'd be interested in hearing a bit more on what you feel you cannot address in principle, and also to make it a bit more concrete, what the sort of talent is, the sort of solution providers you're looking for to address those things that you don't know how to handle.
Interesting.
Take it.
Big question. No, I'm just thinking, I guess again, I try to, let's focus on one sector for a moment and let's stay in chemicals. I think as we all agree to, these primary effects will not really, well, I shouldn't say never ever, but we don't think they will affect us because we are already so regionalized and that's our business model, so that's fine. And there are indeed measures within the Clariant world, for instance, in terms of the supplier management, the risk, the tariff monitoring. So they're very proactive in scenario planning. So this is everything you can. This is in your own control, right? Obviously, what we cannot control is these secondary effects, which we touched upon, which would really be if we play this through the geopolitics, and then let's just imagine demand collapse in the US. Well, of course, that has an effect on everybody, right? I can be very happy with my regionalization, but if a whole market is, the demand slows down, everybody will be affected. And I think it's more about, okay, so if that then happens, let's think that scenario, what else can you do with your company to compensate for that? And frankly, then we are back to some basics, which is be super close to those customers who are still producing stuff that is needed. And I think this push, we touched briefly on it, but innovation and really being differentiated is the best protection, because otherwise you will be slammed with prices. We see that in China and elsewhere. And I could say this is maybe the part, second order is not exactly in my hands, but I can still derive, okay, there will potentially be any gap anywhere. What else can I do? And for me, this is the clear mandate for innovation and to think creatively about those ecosystems we talked about. That would be my first move, yeah.
Yeah, I think when you ask me that question, what I think is really threatening and we don't have on our radar screen is actually another pandemic event with much more deadly consequences.
Another pandemic?
Another pandemic event.
Mm-hmm.
Like an Ebola breakout, which cannot be controlled anymore, where you not talk about, lung diseases and people dying because of age or bad health conditions, but it is deadly from day one. In a minute you get it. And I think a pandemic of such a dimension, of such a quality, would be impossible to control. The second element would be, a vast-ranging war, particularly when it becomes a nuclear war, which also would be, I would say, unpredictable in the consequences. Nevertheless, coming back to the original introduction you had, and also our company was 150 years last year, so it's a coincidence I wasn't aware of, to be honest. They lived through several world wars, and they managed this as well. This is not the end of the world. But what I'm looking as far as talents is concerned, because I think this is what you ask, what kind of leaders do we need in such a situation? It is people who have an inherent resilience. Because even in COVID, and sometimes even today, I can observe leaders which are just blown away by the complexity of the questions we are dealing with in this moment, and they don't take good decisions anymore. And so you need to have inherent, resilient personalities who don't get nervous when things get really, really tight. And this is, I think, what I would be looking for, and what I've seen in the introductory note from you at the survey, who is concerned and how is he related to age. I think it also comes with, you should have seen enough. And in the chemical industry, between 2010 and 2019, we have created a lot of nice weather captains. Now the last 5 years have been rather difficult, and there you see already a clear separation, who managed it well and who didn't.
Mm-hmm. That was, I think, an excellent final comment, summarizing a lot of the topics. So you get the last word, Peter.
I like your question a lot, and I think what bothers me is we need, for our economy to flourish, we need a certain context. And we need institution. Ideally, we need a rule-based kind of way how to deal with each other. And you need a democratic system that people believe in. And unfortunately, there is so much anger in our societies. And it's so easy with social media to fire up this anger and to come up with fake information. And there's always the saying, politicians, please explain your policies better. But that is very difficult because life is complex. And what Donald Trump does and what other parties do, they make it so simple that in the end it's not correct anymore. And I don't know how to deal with that issue, because in the end we need stability, we need institutions, we need democracy to work. Otherwise we have, as a company, we really have big problems. And to be fair, that is something I don't know the solution.
Okay, I would close, however, in the words of the old Greek on the Delphi, you're a philosopher, pantare, and this means everything is flowing. And I think this is probably what we will see. So stability and all this is probably not very high on the agenda for all of us. So firms have to become quite flexible in how they adapt, because things are changing across multiple dimensions, and this is on the other side making it interesting. So thank you very much. Good luck. Thank you very much to the speakers, Claudia, Christian, and Patrick. And I hope and I wish you a good conference for the next time. Thank you. Thank you.